Hi everyone, we're just giving it a few minutes for everyone to trickle into the room and then we'll get the webinar started. All right, hopefully that's given everyone a chance to get in. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy days, likely your lunch break, to join our panel discussion today. My name's Josie Short and I will be the facilitator of today's event. I'm a lawyer at Your Story Disability Legal Support, a free national service supporting people to share their stories with the Disability Royal Commission. And I'm based at the Tasmanian Aboriginal Legal Service. So firstly, I would like to start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people whose lands we all meet on across the country today. I'm in Nipaluna, Hobart, the land of the Muwinina and Palawa peoples of Lutruwita, Tasmania. I pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. As you can see, I'm joined by Deborah Thompson and Heidi LaPaglia-Reid, who have both very kindly given up their time to speak about these important issues with us today. Firstly, just a bit of housekeeping. Our discussion will be followed by a Q&A this afternoon. There is a Q&A function on Zoom just down the bottom. If you have any questions before the end of this discussion, you can pop them in there and we'll answer them at the end. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat button at the bottom. You can ask questions anonymously if you wish to, and if you're joining us today via Facebook Live, you can post your questions in the comments. If we don't get to anyone's questions today just because of time, we will respond via email after the event. Just so that you're aware, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed to the Your Story Disability Legal Support Facebook page. There are captions available, so to turn these on, just go to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click the button labelled CC Live Transcript, and if you're having any troubles with that or any other tech issues, just post in the chat and someone behind the scenes who's more tech savvy than myself will try to assist you. And lastly, I just want to give a bit of a content warning because we will be discussing matters about domestic violence and abuse, and some topics and information may be distressing to some people. So if this webinar does raise any concerns for you, there is some free counselling available. You can call Blue Knot on 1800 421 468, and these details will be shared in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the two very accomplished and empowering women joining me this afternoon, Deb Thompson and Heidi LaPaglia-Reid. Deb describes herself as physically disabled. She has a diagnosis of late onset Friedreich's ataxia, a neurological, genetic and degenerative disorder. Deb was abused by her former partner before her disability became apparent. After leaving her partner, Deb underwent neurosurgery in relation to 2 brain aneurysms, and she sustained an acquired brain injury because of head trauma during episodes of abuse. The surgery exacerbated her disability mentally and physically. Since writing 2 books about domestic violence terrorism, Deb has trained as an advocate for survivors of violence, and she strives for change both for domestic violence survivors and people with disability, particularly those who have experienced abuse by their partner, who, as we know, are often also their carers. With Your Story's support, provided by my colleague David Cocker from Legal Aid, Deb recently shared her ideas and recommendations for change with the Disability Royal Commission. Heidi is a proud autistic feminist activist from Hobart. She is also the Director of Policies and Programs with Women with Disabilities Australia, WIDA. During Heidi's time at WIDA, she has worked on a number of important projects and represents WIDA on a number of advisory groups with sector stakeholders. Among other issues, Heidi has a strong interest in ensuring that efforts to support the safety and reproductive rights of women and non-binary people are inclusive of people with disability. And during all of her spare time, Heidi has also completed a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Philosophy and Arts honours degrees at the University of Tasmania. So I want to welcome you both and thank you so much for sharing your time, expertise and stories with us all today. So to get us started, I might direct my first question to you, Deb. So a main aim of the Disability Royal Commission's hearing that was held in Hobart last week was to expose the nature and the scope of violence against women, girls, non-binary and female identifying people with disability. As a woman with lived experience who has made a submission to the DRC, how prominent do you think these issues are in our community?
Thanks, Josie, for your question. This Royal Commission certainly outlined the severity of the issues that disabled experience. So many are exposed to abuse and violence by the institutions that are supposed to keep them safe and by their partner, who's often their carer as well. And this inquiry is so important because those with disability are a largely forgotten demographic, with much of society aware that this group, that this group's one of the most disenfranchised. We've got 50% living on or below the poverty line. The disabled are twice likely to be abused than the able-bodied. And many people don't realise that the disabled experience even higher rates of abuse than the Indigenous. In fact, domestic violence is the biggest single cause of disability. And the sad truth is that women with disabilities are least likely to report violence or access support services because their experiences are more than likely to be diminished, excused or not believed, and being physically or mentally disabled compounds problems the abused already experience. And when these barriers are systemic, accessing real support is almost insurmountable. And there's contributed factors to heightened abuse of women, children, and the disabled. And they include increased financial insecurity, employment and housing insecurity. And we've heard horrendous and confronting stories by women who have submitted to this inquiry. And are these women coming forward just wasting their time? Not if governments take note of what is being said, with the outcome of this inquiry leading to a greater focus on disability and domestic violence. And I'd just like to say governments must address these issues with real solutions.
Yeah. And Heidi, did you have anything to add about the scope of the issue in our community?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, actually, sorry. First of all, I will acknowledge that I'm calling in from Muwinina country in Nipaluna, Hobart. But yeah, I think Deb covered it really well. But yeah, I'll just add that women with disability do experience all forms of violence at higher rates than women without disability. So it is a really important and prominent issue. Unfortunately, I think while violence against women has gained, I guess, significantly more airtime in recent years, and particularly over the last 12 months, the experiences of women with disability have often been left out. And these are things like the most, what we call egregious forms of violence, including things like forced sterilization, forced contraception, and forced abortion, and the denial of the right of women with disability to make their own decisions about their bodies and other parts of their lives. This happens everywhere, across all settings for all women with disability in various different forms. And for this reason, Women with Disabilities Australia did actually advocate for, first of all, the Disability Royal Commission to happen, and secondly, for the Royal Commission to have that specific public hearing that happened last week on women and girls with disability.
Yeah. And so Deb, you've actually shared your story and your experience with the Disability Royal Commission, not at the hearing last week, but in a submission. What was that process like for you? And why do you think it's important that people do share their story?
Well, as I said, it's really important because our voice is not heard. The disability sector, it's just not heard. And the submissions giving us the opportunity to be heard, to have a voice. But I was asked to share my story by contacts I've made through advocacy work. And I was well supported throughout that process by phone calls, email, Zoom meetings, and this was from Your Story, Disability Legal Support, and Your Story Legal Aid Hobart. And I'd just like to say, given the help I received when submitting to the inquiry, I encourage others to submit in a similar way because the support is freely available, and make use of that. And I'd just like to add that whatever considerations are put forward to the submission to assist victims, we must always be at the centre of decision making and support policy changes. And that's because we're the foremost experts on what we need and can benefit from. And therefore, our submissions are so important.
And I mean, as you've said, the submissions are as important as the government who are implementing the recommendations that are made. But I guess the more submissions we have and the more people that speak up puts pressure on and creates I guess, appetite for those recommendations to be implemented. And Heidi, why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important. I think, as I said earlier, while violence against women is a commonly talked about topic in Australia now, and is all across the media, the specific stories of women with disability do not often get airtime and are not well known about. The Disability Royal Commission, I guess, was started to address some of these issues, but it's not going to be effective if people don't tell their stories. So it is really important that women with disability from all different backgrounds and with all different experiences, including women with disability who've experienced domestic violence, as well as violence in group homes, hospitals, prisons, every setting I guess you can possibly think of, it's really important that we do tell our stories. In regards to the process of telling stories, I know a lot of people do have concerns about that, and it is really important that the Royal Commission does take a trauma-informed approach and is supportive of people through that process. But I thought I'd just flag that Women with Disabilities Australia has developed a range of resources and does have resources to support women with disabilities who are concerned or have questions. So they can be found on our website, which I think will be shared a bit later.
Yeah, it's just we've actually shared that in the chat, and people can access it there. And Heidi, so what do you think after watching the hearing last week? And obviously WIDA have been very involved in getting the hearing set up on this particular issue. What do you think are the most pertinent considerations for the Royal Commission are when they're considering recommendations, and what recommendations would yourself and WIDA really like them to be looking at?
Yeah, so first of all, there's so many things that the Royal Commission needs to address. But I guess for women and girls with disability, one of the key things that we've been advocating for is national legislation, which includes a consistent definition of violence against women, which is inclusive. Currently, definitions and legislation across the country is very ad hoc, I suppose, and it's not consistent across states and territories. And in addition to that, often the legislation that does exist is very focused on intimate partner violence and domestic and family violence, which excludes many of the forms of violence that women with disability experience from carers, from support workers, from medical institutions, from group homes. So that is one thing that we'd really like to see addressed. And I suppose in practical terms, that would mean the Royal Commission providing really clear recommendations to the government on what legislation they need to implement and how they need to do that. And we would definitely like to see that happen in co-design and consultation with women and girls with disability and their representative organisations like WIDA. Another really key area is, as I mentioned earlier, related to the removal of the rights of women and girls with disabilities through, I guess, legal processes like guardianship and power of attorney arrangements, which we call substitute decision making. Essentially, these arrangements are allowed. I give people permission to permit violence against women with disability because they strip away their rights. And they're often used as a routine measure to allow things like forced sterilisation and forced abortion in the name of, I guess, acting in the best interests of women with disability, and particularly women with intellectual and cognitive disabilities, who are often seen as not having the ability to make those decisions for themselves. But the reality is we do have the ability to make these decisions for ourselves with support, and it's completely unacceptable. Sorry, I'm a bit off track.
That's okay.
One particular thing in relation to this that Women with Disabilities Australia has been calling for is the replacement of these practices, so substitute decision-making practices, with a supported decision-making arrangement. So that would have to be a national legislated program that supports not only women with disability but people with disability to make their own decisions, with guardianship and power of attorney arrangements only being implemented in really extreme circumstances where it's essentially impossible for them to do so. This is something that has also been recommended by international human rights bodies, such as the bodies that monitor the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability and so on. And that's been happening for over 15 years, but the Australian government to date has not implemented those recommendations. So these things that we're calling for are not new. We just hope that the Royal Commission, I suppose, will put enough pressure on the government to be able to act on these things rather than to keep ignoring them. I think that kind of summarizes some of the key things that we definitely want to see looked at in relation to things like sexual and reproductive rights violations, such as forced sterilisation. We are also calling for a redress scheme. So basically redress for the many women and girls with disability that have been sterilised against their will or against their consent throughout history, similar to the redress schemes that have happened after other Royal Commissions, such as the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, no, thank you. They're really great recommendations, and hopefully there are enough submissions to get some traction for that. And Deb, did you have any other recommendations that you wish to see happen to add on to what Heidi said?
Thank you, Heidi, for that. It was really clear. I'd just like to say those in authority have heard our evidence. They've heard what we need, what the recommendations are, and these need to be not just paid lip service to or token measures to solutions. We need real targeted solutions being implemented. Otherwise, how can we deem this inquiry successful?
Yeah, no, totally agree. And we've actually got lots of time. So I would love to hear more from you guys. And if there are any questions from the audience, just pop them in the chats now. And hopefully Heidi and Deb will be able to answer those. So I have one question here. What is the best way to hear the voices of people with lived experience of disability and family violence via engaging with advocates or other ways to reach out? How can service providers best support people with disability to disclose abuse? I might direct that one to you first, Heidi.
Yeah, sure. This is it's a good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. I think for one, being supportive and open and including trauma-informed practices is key. It's really important that people with disability who do want to disclose violence or want to be supported to tell their story are not then I guess faced with more trauma and the re-traumatization of having to retell their story over and over again, and also being faced with the lack of support when doing so. So it's really important for any service providers who want to support people with disability to tell their story to become trained in those practices and become aware of how to do that. And to do that in an accessible way. So there's a lot of, I guess, trauma-informed information out there on how to be trauma-informed, but you've got to put on top of that how to do that in ways that are accessible for people with disability. In addition to that, in relation to your second question, or really both questions, I guess I would also say outreach needs to be in a range of forms. So, for example, a lot of the outreach that we do and that the Disability Royal Commission has done is online because of the nature of the way we work and because of the impact of COVID and so on. That's great, and it has actually allowed us to reach more people, for example, in rural and remote areas, and people who wouldn't necessarily engage in an in-person event or service. But it doesn't necessarily reach people who are living in group homes or institutions, or who are in prison, or people with intellectual disability, or people who have low access to technology. So those people really need to be visited in person, and to have those resources given to them in person, and to have support to tell their stories in person, and given, I guess, the information on what that means as well. I might pass to Deb, because I'm really keen also to hear from the perspective of someone who has told your story, how, I guess, you also, what made you want to do that, I guess.
Mainly, thanks, Heidi. I want to do it mainly because I'm tired of seeing royal inquiries and nothing coming, nothing really changing. They're given recommendations, and then governments just seem to think that initial outlays of expense isn't economical, and because it's not immediately profitable, it's not worthwhile. But they should be looking at if the disabled are supported and support services are funded so that we can go and speak to them and get support to submit to inquiries. If those services were well funded, we'd be able to contribute more to the economy immediately as our reliance on welfare and health systems reduces. And for myself, as I said, I was really well supported through Your Story Legal Aid here in Hobart in particular, because I made a written submission. I think those who made face-to-face submissions are absolutely amazing, because it does trigger and re-traumatize often when you speak of your story. So I decided to do a written submission, and I was helped throughout that. It was edited and written succinctly, so the government would take notice, rather than it just being another story from a disabled person.
And I guess, Deb, there's lots of ways people can tell their story, and you chose to do a written submission,
Yeah.
but people can either do it face to face with the commission, or they can do it via video or song or artwork, whatever way kind of works best for them and is, I guess, the least triggering and traumatizing. But for you
Yes.
personally, Deb, was there anything that the organisation, so Your Story or the Disability Royal Commission or any of the supported funded services could have done to make that process better and easier for you?
No, not for me. Getting back to what Heidi said about trauma-informed practice, I know many services, and particularly the legal arena, are being trained to work in trauma-informed ways. And that is so important, because disability is it's incredibly varied, and we need support that targets our own personal disability. Mine's in speaking, but also I tend to prefer things written down, so I was helped in that respect to write my submission rather than do it face to face. But as you said, there are so many ways people can submit according to their level of feeling safe. That's the most important thing, safety.
Yeah. And I guess in relation to this particular topic, there was a hearing on it last week. Some really appalling stories came from that hearing. But that doesn't mean that people can't still raise this topic in submissions. And I guess, Heidi, I just wanted to maybe ask you what you would say to people who do have any stories in relation to the safety of women and girls with disability and who want to go through that process.
Yeah, I guess I would say that your story is really important. Just because the hearing's over doesn't mean that it's not relevant anymore. It's we feel like this hearing and the Disability Royal Commission is just the beginning in a way. I mean, Women with Disabilities Australia has existed for over 25 years now, I think, and the top priority issue of our members has always been, throughout that entire period, the need to address violence against women and girls with disability. So it's such a long-term issue, and we really need to continue to hear the stories of women and girls with disability. I guess if people do want to reach out and do want to tell their story but are unsure, as I mentioned before, you can reach out to Women with Disabilities Australia, or to Your Story, of course, as well. There are lots of supports out there, even if you're just not sure but just want to come and talk to us about what the process is like, and then you decide, no, I don't want to do that, that's fine. We're more than happy to do that.
Particularly even if someone gets, say, halfway through a submission and then changes their mind and thinks it's too hard, then it's perfectly fine for them to not go through with it. And what, Heidi, can allies do to support WIDA and other disability organisations at this stage of the DRC?
Yeah, thank you. And I saw in the chat actually that I just want to acknowledge that this question came from Dr. Linda Steele, who is an amazing academic who actually has supported Women with Disabilities Australia and a huge amount through co-writing submissions on very, I guess, in-depth topics, including things like restrictive practices and sexual and reproductive rights. So Linda has already been an amazing ally, and I suppose that's a great example. Any academics or researchers out there who do work on these issues, there is still room. You can work with disabled people's organisations to help us write submissions. We unfortunately don't have extensive resources to do this ourselves, even though we have done quite a few. It is getting to the point where it's becoming quite difficult. In addition, anyone in the sector, so for example, disability organisations, women's organisations, anyone who works in the prevention of violence against women, whether it's disability specific or not, there has been, I guess, a bit of a lack of conversation around the Disability Royal Commission in comparison to previous Royal Commissions and in comparison to other inquiries that are happening and do happen. It would be great to get some more promotion and support from the sector, from all sectors around this, and get the word out to your members and anyone that you communicate with about the fact that it's happening and that it's important and that there is a timeline. Submissions are closing this year. So yeah, it's kind of now or never, I suppose.
Yeah, and so I guess it's really important for not only people with lived experience to be part of this conversation, but for organisations or people that witness it and in the sector to also speak up and raise that awareness. And I guess to both Deb and Heidi, I know you both followed some of the hearing, or if not all of the hearing last week. Were there any, things that came up during that hearing that you want to discuss or share your thoughts about? Might start with you, Deb.
I'd just like to say generally, after hearing these incredibly confronting stories, the services that Heidi mentioned, they're well aware of the needs of disabled women and try to ensure their safety while sharing their story. But if anything, for me, it's these services that need consistent support with funding from governments to enable them to continue working with and giving vital support to the disabled. Because without these support services, we're particularly vulnerable in society. And yeah, I'd just like to know, actually, I'll say what I need to say.
I think something that I noticed that came out of the hearings and the stories that were shared last week were that women not being listened to. So, reporting at different, not just the police, but at different places where reporting just wasn't listened to, and that violence was able to keep being perpetrated. Heidi, was there anything that really stood out for you in the hearing?
Yeah, I guess for anyone that didn't follow, on days one, the hearing ran for the whole 5 days in the week, and on days 1 to 3, it was very much focused on lived experience witnesses. So there was a range of women, as well as um, gender diverse people, as well as their supporters and allies, who came forward to tell really, I guess, intense stories of violence, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. And a theme, as you mentioned, Josie, throughout a lot of them was a failure of institutions and a failure of service systems to address the needs of women and girls with disability, and to, I guess, act on and believe women and girls with disability when they reported violence. And on top of that, another theme was women and girls with disability being actually wrongly accused as being the perpetrator, which is a common theme that we know happens to especially women with intellectual or psychosocial disability who have, I guess, histories of not engaging with the police and justice systems in a very useful way. And sorry, when I say that, I meant the police and justice systems don't engage with us in a very useful way, not the other way around. So basically, that really highlighted the need for institutions and service systems and the police and the justice system and the courts to improve. There's just so much evidence that accessibility training is needed, disability access policies are needed, disability specialists in these services are needed, so that there is someone that understands and is able to support a woman with disability when they come forward. On day 4, Women with Disabilities Australia did actually give evidence on a lot of these topics as well. So it wasn't me, but my colleagues Carolyn, Tess, and Marley all spoke in depth about many of the issues, some of which we've talked about today, and provided a number of recommendations for change. I won't go through all the evidence that was provided because it would take me too long, but essentially wanted to reiterate that it's really important that those recommendations are implemented and are taken on by the Royal Commission and by the government.
And I guess in the meantime, do you have any recommendations that like legal aid commissions or people that are supporting and helping people with disability report or share their stories? Is there anything that they can do to better support those people in the meantime until we get those recommendations from government?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think, for one, ensuring that all staff are trained in disability and understand different disability accessibility needs and have a disability access policy themselves. Another thing I would say is reaching out to places like group homes and prisons, and I guess settings that are often left out when it comes to outreach from these organisations. And I guess that means that women with disability don't necessarily know that that support is even there. So a lot of women with disability either don't know how to reach out, don't know what their legal rights are. And in addition to that, there is also a much higher risk for women with disability to reach out in many instances, because our perpetrators are often our carers or our support workers, or for a woman with disability who's being experiencing violence in their group home, they might lose their home if they do that, or risk experiencing more violence because of the backlash. So I guess all of these things need to be taken into account. It's very different to, I guess, a woman without disability reporting violence from their family or domestic setting. So yeah, it's really important that legal aid commissions and services consider these issues and think about ways that they can support people through them.
Yeah, and Deb, did you have anything to add to that, or you think legal aid commissions, but also other service providers could do to help ensure the safety, particularly given what Heidi's just said about, domestic settings?
I think Heidi said it all. I certainly agree with everything she said just then. There's a lot of stigma in society towards victims of family violence and the disabled. And when you're a disabled person who's experiencing family violence, it's a double whammy. And like Heidi and a disability advocate, Nicole Lee, she submitted to the inquiry. She said the biggest thing we need is to be believed when we do disclose issues. We need to be believed. We need to not have our concerns minimised. And disability support services in particular understand the boundaries, the barriers that the disabled face when they're trying to disclose. As Heidi said, many of us don't understand our rights. There are barriers, physical barriers to getting to support services, but also we are in fear of being institutionalized if we disclose, or even losing our children and our support, our carer, if they are an abuser. So the inquiry is so important just to highlight all of these, the complexities behind living as a disabled person with family violence.
And there are just so many barriers, I guess, for people coming forward. But I do want to emphasise to people that there are ways to keep your story private. I mean, there are those barriers of being in a domestic setting and things that lawyers and other people can do to assist that to stay private. But through the Royal Commission, you can keep your stories anonymous, and you can seek support through Widow Your Story and other support services to go through that process and keep it anonymous if you want to. So we've just got one last question, sorry. So this is just about outreach. Obviously, this requires lots of resources and expertise to do outreach. What kind of roles would you see doing this within organisations? So maybe Heidi?
Sure. I mean, this is a hard one to answer because it really depends on the organisation and the structure of how you work. But I guess start with a comms person, ask their advice. A comms person could say they could do it if it's within their role, or that they need, for example, a membership engagement officer to go out and talk to people in the community, or it's hard, as I said, because I'm not sure of the context of the organisation. But yeah, there's lots of different people that could do this. I guess it does depend on resourcing and who is able to do it within your organisation.
All right, well, thank you both so much for all of that. I guess we're running out of time, so I just wanted to note that, like I said, just because this public hearing has finished on this particular topic, people are still able to share their stories if they do have anything to share to ensure change and the safety of women and girls with disability. I'd like to sincerely thank Deb and Heidi again for sharing their experiences and thoughts with us this afternoon. It's just so important to have advocates like you both pushing these issues. So thank you for all your work in this area, and I'm personally very grateful for you sharing your time and insight with us all this afternoon. Just a reminder to everyone that free support is available if you do want to share your stories. and any ideas for change with the DRC. The details are on this slide just here, and you can also find us on our website for any additional contact information you may need. We'd also love to hear from you, and there is a survey which you can get on the QR code just there. Otherwise, at the end of this webinar, there'll also be a link to that survey. So we're always open to feedback. And a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. So just search Your Story Disability Legal Support. And lastly, if any concerns have been raised during this webinar, do just want to remind you that you can contact Blue Knot on 1800 421 462. So thank you, Deb and Heidi again, and thank you everyone for joining our panel this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.